You don't know it.
No, I probably don't know the
No, you
show.
don't know.
I don't watch the same shows you watch.
Probably not.
Yeah. And vice versa. Although we both tend to watch Star Trek.
That's right.
Yeah.
We're supposed to talk about specs.
Yeah, so
what
again,
specs matter? Yeah.
what specs matter?
Yeah, so it's kind of the same thing we talked about before, but we'll go on a little bit different basis. We skimmed over some things.
And this is kind of growing on the distortion video 2 things ago, and the synergy video, the last video I did on synergy, and
we had some comments,
synergy, and
constructive comments.
Yeah.
And we'll try to summarize what we think about specs, how much they matter.
Well, I guess it's more of like a comparison between specs.
Yep. So that's the biggest thing. People look at a number and they think, oh, it's a hard number. I could compare it directly with other gear. But no, usually you can't actually. Everybody measures these things differently, and it's differently enough that a direct comparison is almost meaningless.
It's kind of like measurements.
Right.
We're running the same problem. Everyone's using a different
ranges,
rig.
right.
Therefore, the measurements are different for each measurement made.
Yes.
And it's impossible. Not very difficult. Impossible, really, to know
From rig
what you're
to
looking
rig
at.
or person to person,
Yeah.
You need to be on the same system, same setup, same standards.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, people seem to be putting their own little marketing spin on things to try to make their gear look better than others. And it's almost like that race you see back in the day, like car amplifiers, where they would put 4,000 W, and they kind of mean watts, but it's not, because it's not
they're
4,000
alluding
watts.
to wattage,
Right.
but it's
They
not.
can make it look
The
like
amp had like a 2 amp fuse in it.
Yeah, right. It has a 10 amp fuse, and they're saying, oh, 1,000,000 watts.
Well, it can't even draw 50 watts out the battery.
And then you measure it, and it puts out 52.
Yeah, right. If that.
It's like that, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe there's this one situation where you internally short this thing for a brief moment. The caps would discharge at this power rate or something.
Didn't horsepower
no.
measurements used to be like that with cars? Didn't they all over the goddamn place?
Well,
for
they
some
still
reason?
are. Dynos,
Yeah.
same thing. Dynos, between dynos are different numbers.
Yeah, really?
Yeah, so there's
I mean, they seem to be a little more standardized now. I mean,
Kind of,
I mean,
but
what the
it's
manufacturer
messy.
says usually comes out to be similar to what they
well,
measure.
it just
type
says
thing.
this is the dyno we use.
I mean, that's just one spec.
It's
but
kind of like
still.
that, though, with cars,
Yeah.
because they tell you typically crank horsepower,
Yeah.
which is meaningless because your engine is maybe it's producing this power, but that isn't what you feel.
You'd
That
have to
isn't
know
what
the
propels
losses
you.
to the drivetrain.
You have
to know
no idea.
what's
Some
hitting
cars
the
have very
ground.
little losses. Other cars have major
Yeah.
losses. So
Yeah.
it's like a meaningless number almost. It gives you an idea.
You can guess the loss. You know?
well, yeah.
I mean, if it's a stick, you kind of know, but it's not so
You would
bad.
think they would tell you tire horsepower, what actually makes it to
even
the
then.
wheels. They don't.
Yeah.
They don't want to tell you that for some
Yeah.
reason. That's what matters.
It's like
That's
the
what's compelling.
secret sauce, it seems, in for whatever reason.
And I guess
you know?
even more advanced than that, though, wheel horsepower isn't even the only factor. People might think it is, but it isn't, because you got to look at the area under the curve. That's what's accelerating you, because you got a gear train, you got presumably multiple gears, and how much power you average over the duration you're accelerating is the important thing.
Not peak.
So it's your gear, right? It's your gear ratios. It's
Well, I guess amps are like
what
that
speed
too.
you're traveling, how fast you want to be going. That's
And
what matters.
Even
to
then,
get you going.
you still don't know what the car feels like to drive
No.
Well, no.
with any of those specs. You just won't know till you get into it, and hit the gas. So
Yeah, it's the same thing with
that's
electronics.
the subjective side.
Right.
Yeah, same with electronics. It is
How it
actually
feels to
electronics.
use is
Yeah.
a very different thing than the spec sheet would indicate.
So anyway, back to specs.
Yeah, back to
If
specs.
you actually were gonna pay attention to
If
the
you were
spec,
looking at the spec and
right?
you were buying based on spec,
Yeah.
what do you look for? What does it matter? How do you compare? That's a pretty tricky one, actually.
yeah. Well, we don't. We got to hear it. You know, we've given up
Yeah.
on that.
So that's where the rubber meets the road,
yeah,
you would
really.
say, right?
Unfortunately, we've just
Listen,
given up on that.
Power seems to be the biggest one, because a lot of people say like, oh, you need a watt, you need 2 watts, you need 5, 10 watts or whatever. And some people say like, oh, it's fine with 1 watt.
Right.
And other people are like, no, you need 10. So there's not even a consensus there.
Yeah.
So
And that's actually coming. The reason there isn't, I think, is because there's 2 reasons. One, the specs are usually wrong, or they
Misleading.
don't. They may be right. Well, like you were talking about earlier, the spec might be measured at under certain conditions,
right.
yeah.
right? Like a blue moon.
Ideal conditions.
Yeah, right. Or under certain loads.
Yeah, this
This
certain
is
headphones.
very
different
common
headphones,
with
yeah.
distortion.
Yeah.
So if you look at distortion measurements, they tell you more or less the best possible distortion this gear will produce.
Sure.
And they tell you under very specific conditions.
Or
And
they don't tell you the
sometimes they don't
conditions.
tell
Oh,
you
yeah.
the conditions
Yeah,
at
right,
all.
right.
So if you're talking about a headphone amplifier, this is a big one. A lot of people use these numbers on headphone amplifiers. You look at the distortion. So under certain conditions, a certain impedance headphone at certain volume output level, you'll get a certain distortion. And it looks impressive. But that doesn't really indicate your use case scenario.
Yeah,
you don't
we'll,
know.
We'll do that with your headphone.
Right, we'll do it with your load, your impedance headphone at your volume level, because usually they tell you at very low volume, because more often than not, that's where the distortion's best. So they don't really tell you when you're putting out 1 watt or 2 watts. So they tell you when it's like 7 milliwatts.
So let's dumb this down to simplest form. Then what we're saying is that the distortion characteristics vary with the volume.
Well, yeah.
On all
and
electronics.
the headphone load, yeah,
and on what load you put or what headphone you plug in, and that's what people don't understand. You could take the same amp, right, and plug in 10 different headphones, and it may be subjectively sounding different, slightly different on each one of those headphones. Even though you got 10 different headphones, that's in itself a difference.
That's what makes it
but
really
the
hard.
amp may not react the same to each of those loads, and we see this with speaker amps. Anyone who's done a number of reviews with speakers or done it, had a number of speaker systems, you're the same way, right? Different amps, same amp, different speakers.
Yeah, oh yeah.
It'll act different.
Well, it's hard to tell what the change is because the speakers or headphones are changing.
And you
too.
don't always know.
That's the thing.
Yeah. You know why you don't always know? Because you don't always know what the spec is at that particular. Even the speaker manufacturer's spec may not be perfect. They'll rate it at 8 ohms, but it may dip to 2 or 3 ohms at certain frequencies, which the amp's then going, help me.
Yeah,
I can't
some
drive this load.
Do spec that though.
Yeah.
There's a minimum, like
some do.
4 2 ohm minimum.
Yeah, some do.
So then but you don't know where that is.
Right.
So,
right.
But most companies aren't willing to give you unflattering specs. So if they provide specs, they're going to tell you usually the good ones. Some companies are actually really good about this, but in general, they're intentionally misleading.
What you would need to know is you first of all, you'd have to be fairly technical.
Yeah.
You would need a graph. If you want to know distortion characteristics versus, you need a graph that shows distortion, vertical, output level, horizontal, and then it would show you, how the distortion levels vary with the output volume, or
that's
output,
pretty uncommon
or
to
with
see
an amp
that.
output volume. Yeah, I'm sure the manufacturers have that, but they're going to pick the lowest part on the graph to give you the measurement.
Well, and at different loads too, ideally.
Sure, right.
So you'd have a lot.
Yeah, you
It's
could have.
complicated.
So it's right. So it is complicated,
and then even interpreting it, it's not that obvious.
No, it's not really. And even then, you still don't know what the hell it's going to sound like, because that's just one. Distortion is just one characteristic. What is the distortion?
Right.
What's it composed of? Is it composed of odd harmonics or even harmonics? So, this is why there's no one measurement that can tell you what something sounds like. Because
57.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but
this is a 98.
So that's not to say distortion doesn't matter. Distortion matters a great deal. But if you just look at the specs, that doesn't really mean much. You can't really directly compare. You don't know how it's going to sound from a distortion spec unless you have a graph for both devices measured in the same conditions. You really can't compare it.
Well, it's a system. That's the thing.
Yeah.
So it's not just the amp, just the DAC.
Right.
The whole system.
The overall system, where the distortions are in the drain. It's right. We're picking on amps because it tends to be what people tend to look at specs with
Usually,
the most. But sure, transducers, headphones, speakers, same deal.
Yeah.
They have their own distortion characteristics, and again, they're spec'd at certain frequencies, certain playback levels, and they're how they respond or react within a room setting, how the room sounds too, is affecting it. I mean, you think about it. Even if you did have a speaker spec with like a loudspeaker in a room, you don't know what the hell it's going to do in the room until someone tells you what it might do in the room, or you hear it in your room.
Yeah, I saw Stereophile started doing that, measuring it in this was in John Atkinson's room. This is what it looks like.
Yeah.
So they kind of
the actual measurement within the room, a certain part. How far is the mic from the speaker? I didn't even notice that.
They take 2
feet?
measurements, off axis on it. So, so that's pretty good that they tell you everything they're doing.
Yeah.
Some people are open about this and they tell you exactly what's going on.
Well, they know the variables.
Right.
There's a lot of them.
Yeah, we'll try to give you a little more information, but technically you'd need a graph. You need to plot how the speaker sounds at all points in the room. You'd have to understand reflection points, blah blah blah. They
just go with a mic mapping out the whole room.
Yeah, and I mean, hell, we had it done once on our last place we were at. We had a real bass issue. 2 walls were concrete was a bad place to put a sound room, you know, and a real bass issue. I mean, we had humps around in the 30-some range and I think in the 50-some range that were just brutal. They were 10 plus dB. And I mean, it was just obvious. And
like completely dead zones.
Yeah, right.
Nothing.
You can walk around a room and it'd be a boom, blow it out, and other parts would be gone. And it's like, oh my God. So yeah, we wound up spending a fortune on diaphragmatic bass absorbers to solve the issue. With means we needed 8 of these huge freaking big boxes in our listening room. You know, it was either that or we build special soffits in the room with Helmholtz resonators.
Another room in that room.
Yeah, or either way, it wasn't a good scene, which told me don't do that or make a room with 2 walls that are concrete again. But anyway, where the hell was I going with this? I forgot.
Specs. What matters?
Here we go.
Yeah.
But yeah, the room is huge too. And I mean, you know, and again, there's no. We had actually someone do professional measurements to that room come in. That's where I was going. They came in and they took a microphone and spent most of the day in our room. Cost like $2,000, I think. All right. I mean, I think we got an industry accommodation, but it was freaking expensive. And you don't really find too many companies that can do this. But they'll come in and they'll basically run test tones and go around the room with a microphone and give you a plot and come back in a week or so and give you a book basically that shows, you know, all the pages plotted, frequencies, various areas within the room, where your problems are, and potential solutions for them, right? And refer you to companies that could solve the problem. And it's like, I mean, you know, that's what it took to get a room, to try to get a room flat, where the room wasn't as much of an issue as the speaker and the system. You know, and you think about that, it's like, damn it, that's a lot of work, right? And here we are worried about 0.0003% distortion on an amplifier when your room is a piece of shit.
Well,
right? I mean, relatively speaking, right?
It's all about the context.
You know?
Because a lot of people, you look at the numbers and it's easy to get caught up in them. You see, well, this number's better than that number. But you got to understand how the numbers were measured, how they arrived at that conclusion. And at the end of the day, it doesn't even matter. Do you care about that difference? Some people do. But most of the time, you're not going to hear it. You're not going to notice it. And it may not even really be real.
I think the only reason you got to dig that deep is if you're up in a professional setting, you're a pro.
Oh yeah.
And you do maybe if you do measurements for a living.
If you're doing measurements,
these you got to freaking worry about this shit big time.
Sure.
But if you're just a casual, you know, human being trying to listen to music,
trying to enjoy music, playback,
this is way beyond your need to go there. You know, it really is. Unless that's what you do.
Yeah.
If you're into it, cool. That's great. You know, if you're an engineer and this is one of your pet peeves, deal with it. Great, work with it. But I tell you, in the end, you know, I mean, you want to correct room errors. You got to kind of do that. Otherwise, there's just no good way to enjoy it other than get a different room.
Right. That's a hard thing to do usually.
You know? Yeah. With most people, they're stuck. Room. They're stuck. Yeah. They got a home with kids and they're in a room, and that's the room.
Yeah. I find the biggest problem is windows. Giant windows.
Windows are a problem.
Because then glass you can't like just put things in front of it.
There's no glass in this room for that reason. Yeah. You know? But yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, the other way to do it is near field. You just get closer to the speakers, and that helps to negate the room.
Yeah, that's what I do.
You know?
I just toe the speakers in a lot more than I normally would.
Yeah, and get close.
And then move forward.
Yeah. Now, some speakers won't let you do that because they'll scream at you and, okay, get a different speaker. You want to get speakers that are made for more, you know, near field means like a couple feet away, you know, a meter away, something like that. You know, where a normal listening session, you'd be about 2.5 meters or so from the speaker, maybe more depending on the size of the room, about 8 feet, 10 feet.
I'm 13 feet away.
Speakers are about that far apart. Yeah, but you're really far apart. Yeah. So you hear the room where you are, big time, you know.
Well, luckily we make headphones, not speakers.
But in a headphone, especially in a well-designed headphone, the room is the ear pad.
Room ships with the headphone.
Yeah, we designed it. Done.
So you get a pretty good room out of the box, you hope.
Yeah.
And you're taking it with you, so you always have your room.
Yeah. You always have a room, It's portable.
The same sounding room, so you're all used to it.
Yeah. So that solves those distortion problems.
Yeah, but there's more than distortion. We kind of, I think we went enough in depth on that one. You could talk for a long time about distortion. It's a very complicated subject. But beyond that, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of specifications that can matter. And people talk about power all the time, and power can matter, certainly. If you have a headphone amplifier that puts out 3 milliwatts peak, it's not going to work but anything other than super sensitive IEMs.
It's pretty useless in the high end.
And oddly enough, more often than not, the power isn't that misleading. Usually the power numbers they tell you are pretty representative of the output of the device.
Usually.
They're pretty close. You know, if it says 3 watts, it's not going to put out 0.1 or 50. It's probably about that. Sometimes they're a little high, sometimes they're a little low, actually.
The confusion is, though, is again, under what load conditions.
Right.
You
But
know?
a lot of times they do try to give you an actual
Usually
impression.
one though.
I mean, some tube amps, I think,
One
they
load.
actually, the power goes down as as your impedance goes lower. They
depends.
don't double like
Yeah.
a solid state amp tends to try to double every time you have the impedance. So if you go from 50 ohms load to 25 ohms, technically speaking, a perfect amplifier will put out twice as much power into that load,
Not all
into a
do.
25 ohm load versus a 50. Most cry trying to do it. The power supplies choke. They run out of power at some point. That's the limitation, you know,
Yeah.
internal resistance, all that stuff. But, you know,
I think the ones that do vary a lot with load, they usually add more load specs. So they have like 5 or 6.
The tube amps do.
32, 64,
Yeah.
300, 600.
Yeah.
So
And
that you get a better idea.
I think I've used some solid state designs that I don't know, for whatever reason, the way they're designed, they actually drop output as they go lower. I think to protect themselves. I mean, the reality of it is they only have so many output devices. They can only put out so much power. So, okay, if you're going to throw a dead short on me, I'm sorry, I'm not giving up the ghost. I'm just going to stop putting out power. So I've seen some of them where they actually. So again, you got to watch the specs at whatever impedance it's rated at,
Yep.
and kind of try to match up as close as you can to whatever your rated impedance is of the headphone.
But if you know your headphone impedance and the amplifier is rated somewhere near that, you could pretty much trust that the amplifier's ratings for power are going to be pretty close.
You could trust that, but then again, I've heard 1 watt amps sound as big as 4 watt amps, and I've heard 2.5 watt amps sound like 10 watt
Yeah,
amps.
that's another thing. Yeah.
So, and we've never measured them to confirm what the spec is. We have, you know, because it's not really our thing here. It's not what we do. But, you know, tube amps can sound bigger sometimes, or seem like they have more headroom. A solid state amp can run out really quick, just go into clipping like out of nowhere. And a tube amp seems like it clips more softly. They tend to clip differently. They have different distortion characteristics when you get them at their peak. And they tend to be a little easier to listen to even when they're in the clipping. They're not as noticeable when you hit peaks. You know, it's a softer clip.
Well,
It's
I know.
more blah,
That's
rather
why,
than
like guitar amps, that's why everybody prefers tube amps.
yeah.
Because everybody's distorting them all the time.
Yeah, right.
And if you ever heard a distorted solid state guitar amp, it doesn't sound.
It'll rip your freaking head off.
It's not great.
Especially with strings.
Yeah.
It's bad enough
Yeah.
you got a string with all this harmonic information, right? You've got the fundamental string note, and you've got multiples of that note coming out of that string. And then you throw it through a distorted electronics that's clipping the piss out of it. It just sounds like a broken string, I guess, is what it would sound like, times 10.
They're apparently better
Yeah.
now, but yeah, tube amp is the way to go for most people because it's easy. You know, it'll break up the way you want it
Well,
to.
and the electronics, just the pedals and stuff, they're made to distort in an analog fashion, right?
Well, yeah.
They add rounded distortions. They don't. It's not sharp clipping square waves.
Well, some are.
So, yeah, well, if you want to hear
If
that,
you want
great.
that, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's not to say that more power is always better, though, for clarification,
No.
right? So
No, you need enough.
you need enough.
Whatever
if you
that
have,
is.
If it's rated at 10 watts, it doesn't mean it's better than an amp with 1 or 2. You need to meet more or less the manufacturer's recommendations. And a lot of times they'll give you a ballpark. And if they don't, you could always inquire within if you're completely unknown on that one. But more often than not, as long as the power rating on the amplifier is roughly what you need, you don't need to worry about it past that. You go on to the next spec, right? It's not that critical. If you have an amp that puts out 2 watts comparing to an amp with 1 watt, it doesn't mean the 2 watt one's better. It makes very little difference, surprisingly.
Well, not in the big picture,
Right.
but it could be. Sometimes, though, you got to watch that because if power and gain get confusing too, and we covered this in the past, and if you don't have enough gain, you can't turn the volume up high enough to get to the level
This
that
is
the
getting
headphone will
complicated.
play at. So
Yeah.
yeah, I know. There's no again. There's
no
a slippery
easy way
slope.
out with this one.
Oh, once again, you're really best to default to the manufacturers, particularly of the speaker, the headphones, and just ask them. What do you guys think is good for an amp or whatever? And
Yeah.
you know,
I mean, they know.
yeah. And if they don't,
trouble
then talk to
is-
somebody else.
It's not like there's one spec that's like, oh, this is the spec you need to worry about. They all matter. They all make a difference. It's just a question of how much,
Yeah.
right? And so when you're in the really high end, these specs they kind of matter in a different way than in the low end. In the low end, you're kind of trying to fill the need for it to meet the task, for it to have enough volume and drive your headphones well. Because especially if you have like a high impedance headphone, it may not be driven well off a phone or a computer output or something like that. And so you just need an amplifier that'll drive them at all to a reasonable level.
Yeah.
But
So
then you
it
move into the
works.
high end, you got very different demands.
Yeah.
So it really is a tricky thing.
Yeah, it is difficult. You know,
The
and
specs matter, but
it boils right down to one of those things where you kind of got to try stuff or know someone that has tried stuff and start from there and try to narrow it down, you know.
Well, I know particularly with power, people with Macintosh amps, like if they never had one before, and all you're doing is looking at the meters the
Oh,
whole time.
yeah.
Obviously, you're like, I'm
Big
surprised
meters.
I'm using like 3 watts all the time. You got 500 watt amps,
Yeah, no
but
shit.
most of the time you're not using any of
That's
it.
true. I visit the local speaker shop once in a while, and they got the big
Yeah.
Macs on there, and they got those big lit meters, and the meters are always at the bottom of the
right.
scale, you know,
Yeah,
unless
I mean,
you're cranking the
sometimes,
shit out of
yeah,
it.
Yeah,
you
but
know,
most of the
but,
time,
yeah,
you don't
right.
need 500 watts.
No, but it sure as hell sounds good to have that
Well, it looks
extra
nice.
478 watts on top.
Yeah, it's nice to know it's there.
It's just effortless.
So that's a different thing. You know?
Yeah.
It's just,
Well, once you hear effortless, it's tough to go back. You suddenly realize what constrained means on an amplifier, you know, or on a system. So it's hard to go back, you know.
I'm getting the impression we could ramble for about 4 hours on this
Yeah,
topic.
we sure as hell can, and we always do.
This is heading nowhere.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, so.
So thanks for watching. If you have an idea for a future episode, let us know in the comments below. Let us know what you think about measurements, how much they matter to you. And as always, stay subscribed to see more content like this from us. Take care, guys.